if caregivers are feeling seen and feeling more understanding of their own emotions after reading the book, then I feel like I've done my job. And as you say, there's 100 other things that I'd like people to take away from it. And I would love policymakers to take things away from it, or, people who
Yes.
are doing HR to take things away from it about how to support caregivers through laws, through benefits, through all kinds of things. But what really means the most is to know that caregivers don't feel as alone and as unseen after they've read my book.
Did you know that in 2020, there were 53 million caregivers in the United States? And by 2025, this number is expected to grow to 62.5 million. 73% of these caregivers also have a job. They are called working caregivers, and they are invisible because they don't talk about their caregiving challenges. Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees, is a podcast that will show you how to support working caregivers. Join Selma Archer and Zack on the Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees podcast as they show you how to support working caregivers.
Welcome back to our podcast, Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees. And as you know, we love to spotlight people who are making a huge difference in the care economy. And Selma, how you doing? Good to see you.
I'm doing great. How
All
about
right.
you?
I'm doing fantastic. So Selma Archer, Zack here, and we have a great author with us today. And I read this author's book, Already Toast, which is an incredible, catchy title. Can't wait to hear more about this. But I read it, I think, over a couple of years ago when I was doing a lot of research as a care advocate. And this book is incredible when it comes to really giving you insight into what a caregiver's life is all about, but much, much more. And so we're really excited to delve into this. But before we do that, let's bring Kate Washington up on here with us. Hey, Kate.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure and honor. Thank you for being here. So we like to start off by asking you just kind of a question about you, if you don't mind. It's been a hot summer out there. So what's something kind of fun or interesting you'd like to share with our audience that you've been working on this summer?
Well, I live in Sacramento, California, and California is known as a dry, hot place a lot of the time. But my favorite aspect of my area is that we have dozens of rivers and amazing swimming holes and little hidden gems in the mountains and beyond that you can go out to. And so that's kind of my passion and my biggest interest in the summer is taking the day and getting to a river and getting in it. It's my favorite thing. And I've been working actually on a longer project about swimming holes and wild swimming and self-rediscovery.
Wow, that's really
Yeah.
cool. I like that. That's really
Yeah.
cool. I'm trying to remember the Spanish name for swimming holes. When we were in Mexico with on a family trip, we went to a couple.
Oh, the cenotes?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. Incredible, cool, refreshing. Some of them a little scary.
Yes.
So
I really want to visit those, but I haven't had a chance.
you got to add that to your
Yes.
content.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you'll have to keep us up to date with that project. That sounds amazing. Let's talk about this book. And again, it's an amazing, eye-catching title. You had me right away. I bought it just by the title alone. I'm like, I've got to meet the author that wrote this. So Kate, tell us a little bit about, how you came about writing this book, why you wrote it, and tell us about the title.
Sure. So the book is really the story of my caregiving for my now former husband in the toughest years were 2015 and 2016. He had really severe lymphoma and a bone marrow transplant that left him at the time profoundly disabled. He's now recovered his independence, I'm thankful to say. But it was a very, very difficult journey for both of us and took me really by surprise. And I was thrust into more than full-time caregiving for, over 2 years, really. I have always been a writer. I've been a freelance writer for much of my career, for 20 years. And a lot of how I coped, even in the hospital bedside when he was in the hospital for more than 4 months, was writing about it. And I also wanted to be reading about trying to understand why this experience of intense caregiving was so difficult and so all-consuming. I have a lot of privilege. We live close to the hospital. We have family support. And still, I was just frazzled and at the end of my rope. And I was trying to figure out why that was. And so essentially, as time went on, I evolved toward writing the book that I wanted to read to explain the experience of caregiving to me at the time that I was going through it. What I tried to do was weave together my story with reporting on the social conditions, the economic conditions around caregiving, culturally, why it's often skews much more toward women, what the values of caregiving are in our culture, and why it's so often devalued or not valued at all. So I tried to not just make it a memoir of caregiving, but also an explanation and a cultural critique of the phenomenon of caregiving, which I think is often so hidden. And as to the title, where that comes from is maybe about a month after my husband Brad was discharged from his bone marrow transplant. And mind you, he went home blind, unable to eat, severely immune compromised, unable to walk. He'd been hospitalized for 4.5 months. He hadn't seen our kids for 3 months of that. We had young kids at the time as well. And when he came home, his doctor said to me, he needs 24-hour care. He can't be left alone even for a minute. And I said, that's impossible. That's impossible for a person to do. It's medically ordered, but it's impossible. And there's no insurance support for paying in-home caregivers or anything. We dipped into savings and got in-home caregivers. But it was a very challenging time because, I was managing in-home caregivers as employees. I was managing his health. I was managing the needs of 2 kids who were on summer vacation and a lot of other things. And I took him to a follow-up appointment on like a 106-degree day and was just frazzled at the end of my rope, as I said. And in the appointment, I just started to cry. And I just sat there kind of with tears just rolling down my face. And the doctor looked at me and he said, "Are you taking care of yourself? Because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of him." And I thought, I didn't really say anything, but I kind of went from sad to mad because I thought, why are you putting that taking care of myself on my to-do list? My to-do list is already 1,000 miles long. And I'm sure many of your listeners will know exactly how that feels of like putting your own, we hear self-care all the time, but it's at the end of the list for so many of us because it has to be, because other people's needs are more urgent. And so, but I'm a good rule follower. And so I went home and I Googled to look for like caregiving support groups and caregiving resources. But what ended up happening was that Google auto-populated my search with caregiver burnout. And I clicked and it took me to a quiz. And I took the quiz. And the result that I got was, "You're already toast." And I literally, because I was already working on some writing at the time, I think I literally tweeted that day, like, "Well, I found my book title." And, it stayed the book
Awesome.
title through years of working on pitching the book and like marketing meetings about the book and all kinds of things. And I'm happy it did because for me, it really conveys the feeling that so many caregivers reach almost before they even identify as caregivers. It's
Mhm.
hard for a lot of people to take on that identity and say, like, that's what I'm doing. I'm a caregiver. I spend my 25 hours a week as a caregiver instead of on leisure or something. They don't claim it as an identity or understand that that's the feeling of pressure that's, pushing them to the brink of burnout. And so they reach burnout before they even come to grips with
Yeah.
where they are in their journey as a caregiver. And no shame to people. I think it's just so often invisible and just like you're just doing what's expected of you as a daughter, as a sister, as a son, as a parent, as a spouse, because somebody needs the help.
That's where I feel your book and why we're so excited to have you here, because
Definitely.
most of our listeners are leaders, HR, benefits people, and yes, most of them probably have a caregiving experience, and maybe that's why they're interested. But those that don't, they probably would say, "Why would I want to read this book?" And you just gave 100 reasons as to why somebody should be better prepared. And just one other quick comment. I've been talking to as many providers, doctors as possible every time I'm with them about you guys need to do a little bit better job with 2 things. One, asking questions like you do in your normal pre-doctor visit. You know how they ask you, "Are you feeling depressed? Have
Mhm.
you had any arguments with your spouse?" Well, they should ask, "Are you a caregiver?"
Mm.
And are you feeling any burnout or something like that? And then the second thing is to actually have a conversation with you in the doctor's visit.
Mhm.
When you reflect back now, what would have been a better way for that physician to have addressed that with you?
Well, I mean, I think I would step back even from the physician's responsibility in that one appointment and say that I've heard about some clinics or things, especially for things like dementia, Alzheimer's. I think there's starting to be places that are looking at a patient not just as an individual patient, but as a member of a family system and a member of a
Mm.
care team,
Oh, yeah.
and including the caregiver not only in care decisions, but also in treatment and in assessment. Like, I think something that people in cancer clinics, in, Parkinson's, geriatricians, doctors who are treating ongoing either severe or chronic conditions, it would be absolutely revolutionary if it became the standard practice to do just a quick caregiver wellness assessment whenever
Yes.
somebody's accompanying a loved one to a doctor's appointment. Wouldn't even have to be more than 2 minutes to ask like 3 or 4 basic questions about caregiver wellness and whether they're coping, because the demands on caregivers are, as you know, incredibly high, and they've increased so much, especially in terms of hands-on, often highly technical or skilled medical care. People are sent home from the hospital doing wound care and line
Yeah.
care and catheter
Like
care, things that
like you
only a
were.
nurse would have done a generation
Yeah.
ago. Just check in. Like, are you coping with that? How is that going? How is your mental health? How is your physical health? Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Clinics, I think, of a wide range of types could include thinking about the wellness of the caregiver as part of the wellness of their patient.
So, Kate, in reading your book, first of all, I agree with everything that Zach has said about it. It was just so powerful and gripping and honest. You have a way of writing that actually drew me into the story. I felt like I was on the journey with you because
Thank you.
everything was so vivid and crisp, and you talked about your emotions, and you talked about, what was going on from day to day, and the unexpected events that happened, and the setbacks and the milestones. And it was just from the very beginning, when I read your results of the test on Google that said you're already toast, to the end, I was hooked. I was hooked. It was amazing. But having said that, I just wondered from your perspective, in terms of your purpose for writing the book, what is one thing, I'm sure there are many, but what is one thing that you would like the reader to get and walk away with after reading your book?
Well, I think for me, the one thing that I want readers to take away, and particularly readers who are caregivers, which I think is almost all readers, like almost everyone is either a caregiver now, was one, or will be
Will
someday.
be one.
So,
Yeah.
but I specifically mean, active caregivers or people who have experience with those challenges, and trust me, I'm incredibly flattered when people in that world are able to read my book, because I know how little time there is for anything extra. So I take it as a very high compliment, whenever I hear from a caregiver, because they've not only taken the time to read the book, but also reached out to me, and it's so gratifying. What I would love for those readers to take away, and I've, been so honored to hear from many people who have taken this away, is validation. I
Mhm.
want them to know that their emotions around caregiving are valid, that it's valid to feel you want them to get well, you want things to be better, you want to take care of them. At the same time, it's totally valid to be angry, to sometimes be resentful, to be fearful, to have negative feelings around caregiving that you maybe didn't choose. And if caregivers are feeling seen and feeling more understanding of their own emotions after reading the book, then I feel like I've done my job. And as you say, there's 100 other things that I'd like people to take away from it. And I would love policymakers to take things away from it, or, people who
Yes.
are doing HR to take things away from it about how to support caregivers through laws, through benefits, through all kinds of things. But what really means the most is to know that caregivers don't feel as alone and as unseen after they've read my book.
I was reading in your book, you did do some things to try and help yourself in terms
Mhm.
of the emotional, trying to have emotional outlets for yourself and take time off and try to get some space to yourself. What exactly would you recommend to someone that's that's on that journey right now, things that maybe worked for you, things that maybe didn't work so well, what would you suggest to someone that's in your shoes right now?
hmm I would say that the more honest you can be about with your inner circle about your needs and
Mm.
asking for help, the better. And let people step in and support you. Let people step in and support you maybe before you think it's a crisis so that it doesn't get to the point of being a crisis. Ask, it's hard to ask for help. So many of us
Yes.
have challenges with it. We live in this individualistic society. We don't want to admit that we're flailing. But, it's not you, it's the system. It's a system that sets caregivers up to fail by not providing enough underpinnings or support for us. There's no shame in needing help when you are in a completely untenable situation where somebody tells you you need to be watching an ill person 24 hours a day because you need to close your eyes and sleep or you'll be unable to continue, right? So get help, get support where you can, rely on your community, rely on your people. I was fortunate to have a lot of community pitching in. And now that I'm no longer in need of it, I do try to pay it forward. If you have access to mental health support services,
Mm.
to therapy, and I know that's not something everybody has access to or time or money for, but if you have that access or can use like an EAP through your work or social services through a hospital, having a space that's just for yourself where you can express your emotions and where you're at the center instead of your loved one or care recipient being at the center of the needs, like, because your needs are totally valid also. So if you can get that kind of support or a support group, rely on friends, and get as much sleep as you can.
Wow. That was great, Kate. Thank you for sharing that. Listeners, if you think, Kate, just in this short interview is impressing you, you really do need to read this book.
Yeah.
Selma, you did share with me that you loved also the literary
Oh
part.
yeah, I thought the references to the Victorian literature, Jane Eyre, and it was just unbelievable. It was brilliant. It was how did you think of that? Because when I was going to high school, Jane Eyre was like a prerequisite. I was an English major. That was, a book that was on the list. You had to read it. You had to understand it. You had to report about it. And I never, all that time, ever noticed all the caregiving that was in that book. I had no idea until I read your book. It's like, she's absolutely right. How did I miss that? Could you talk just a little bit about that?
I missed it too, and I wrote about Jane Eyre in my PhD dissertation, so you are not alone. I have a PhD in Victorian literature, and I didn't really think about the care in Victorian literature and what a major part of it is. That is. And then when I started rereading these books that were kind of my comfort reads when I was in the
Yes.
middle of it, and I was like, oh my goodness, like the caregiving is everywhere, which makes sense because most care was not taking place in hospitals or under the auspices of doctors in the Victorian era. It was done at home. And that's where we got a lot of our notions about what a good caregiver is, what a good wife caregiver or daughter as a caregiver is. The angel in the house is this
Yes.
Victorian trope. Really, I'm so grateful to you for asking about that because it was an important part of the book to me and something that really drew on an academic background. I don't work as an academic. I no longer am in that field, but that field is near and dear to me. And I was excited to write about those cultural elements of caregiving and like the kind of the cultural history of caregiving through literary analysis.
That was great.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Selma was really excited about that. And I thought it was very unique in the approach because I've read quite a few books on caregiving, and I thought that was unique. And as a non-literary guy, I will say the analogies helped quite a bit.
Okay.
They really
Yeah.
did. So good job, Kate.
Thanks.
I do want to jump in. There's so many parts of this book. We don't have that much time, but there is one section, and I love the way this section is called "Take Care Now," and you talk about how 4 months you're with, Brad, and I mean, I was 1 week with my father when he was in intensive care. I can't even imagine what 4 months is like. I can't. It's just incredible. Many interactions with parking attendants, if it's not automated. And you talk about how the parking attendant said, take care now. and how that really hits you. So I thought that was great. But there's a part in here that I just want to read out and get some more insight into it, because it's an important piece that Selma and I really focus on whenever we're talking to business leaders. Even in government, numbers matter, data matters, right? Let's face it, at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
what Selma and I are trying to do with our book, and what you did very well with your book, is you want to humanize that somewhat.
Yes.
And your statement here, I just want to read it. It really hit me. And I just want to get a little bit more insight. But you said, not knowing what lies ahead, living with the dread of loss, unable to attend to one's basic needs because of the urgency of another person's, those are the aspects of caregiving that can't be conveyed by all the statistics in the world. Can you share a little more about that? Because the statistics in itself are pretty profound, but what you just shared there, you're right. Statistics don't say anything about your story.
Yeah. I guess I think of it as, the latest numbers, and these are almost 5 years old at this point, are that there are 53 million caregivers in the US. It's a huge number. It's like so big, it's impossible to wrap your mind around. But then you think of that as like 53 million stories of somebody who's worried about their mom, who's seen a brother not be able to take care of themselves and is trying to advocate to get them like maybe the mental health care they need. Like there's literally 53 million stories behind that. And every single one of us, every HR manager, every, CEO, every listener of yours, everyone is somebody who, if they haven't been a caregiver, have seen in their family something that has happened, where you're worried about somebody, where you're thinking you're going to lose a loved one. Like illness and disability and grief and loss touch us all. It's what makes us really human. The statistics, as you say, are so important, but what I hope to do in this book, with my own story, but also to convey about how other people are experiencing this like very deeply human, deeply important kind of relationship of caring for each other, is that, it comes for us all. And we all have a story. Mine, some of the intensity of what I wrote there came from, there was a solid month of the time that Brad was in the hospital when it seemed we were pretty sure he was going to die. It really seemed like he was going to die. And including like his doctors were conveying that message, and I was kind of trying to hide it from my kids. And I was like, just constantly living, not knowing if I could draw a breath, not knowing what was going to happen, thinking all the time about plan A, plan B. What am I going to be like, a widowed mother to these two kids? How am I going to cope? His parents were living with us to help out at the time. How do I help and support them? Who's going to support me? How is this going to happen? Those kinds of uncertainties are unbelievably stressful. And whether it's caregiving or a similar situation or not, I think everyone listening can identify with that feeling of like, I don't know what's coming next. I'm scared. And I still have to keep putting one foot in front of the other and doing this thing that needs to get done. And so that's, I think where that passage that you read came from.
We got time for one more, Selma.
Well, just picking up from what you just said, I was going to ask another question, but I want to ask this question, if you don't
Sure.
mind.
Okay.
And that is, looking back over your caregiver journey from day one, from the beginning, when you went to the doctor with your husband and he gave the diagnosis, and looking back now that your journey is over and you've moved on with your life, what is one thing you would have done differently had you known then what you know now?
Oh my goodness. I'm not sure if I can narrow it down to just one. I would have set boundaries around the time and emotional space that I had to give for myself earlier, because I kind of jumped all in really early on. It's sort of like I didn't know that it was going to be a marathon. I thought it was going to be a sprint, and I started out sprinting, and like a lot of people do, you kind of then falter in the late miles.
Burnout sets in.
Yeah. And I mean, and I feel like there were a lot of things that I was able to continue doing that served me well. I kept exercising or trying to stay in touch with friends or things like that. But I think just knowing like this, like, experience is almost universal, that I wasn't alone. Like, I think I would have liked to have known that or understood that a little bit better and sought kind of connection and support specifically around the caregiving earlier on, because I was seeking connection and support around his diagnosis and our fears around the diagnosis, but that's different from support for caregiving specifically, if that makes sense. A lot of the early things that I was doing, especially, were like for him and for the crisis of our family, which was also appropriate and needed. But I put myself last for a really long time. And I think that that led to some real fallout for me that it took me a long time to unravel from and kind of recover from.
I think we can all relate to that. So it's great to hear you reiterate. And you say validation. I feel very validated after reading your book. So
Yeah.
you achieve that extremely. On your website, you talk about that you'll speak in front of organizations. I hope organizations will take you up on that, because you've got a great story to tell. What's next for Kate Washington besides exploring swimming holes?
Well, actually, I am working on a second book that is partly inspired by exploring the swimming holes. It's not a guidebook, but it's a book about kind of self-rediscovery and refinding joy at midlife. I turned 50 not very long ago, and my project leading up to turning 50 was going to 50 different swimming holes and sort of how that helped me like find some change in life. I'm working on that. I continue to be a freelance. My two daughters bring me a huge amount of joy. My older one, they were 9 and 5 when their dad was diagnosed, and they're now a sophomore in college and high school, respectively. So times have changed and moved on. They keep me busy and engaged, and so does my work and my writing. So I'm just continuing on. But I still, love connecting with and talking with caregivers and talking about that journey, because I think it's really an under-recognized growing crisis in the US. There's a crisis of care. It's already here. It's only growing, and we need to reckon with it.
Speaking of connections, what's the best way people can connect with you?
Through my website, kaawashington.com. My book is available pretty much everywhere online. You can find me on, various social media. Probably the easiest way right now is Instagram @WashingtonKate. So
awesome. Well, please don't stop writing, Kate, because you're amazing.
Thank you.
You do have a gift for sure. And thank you for sharing it with us. And thank you for your time. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to catch new episodes of Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees podcast, every other Tuesday. Please also visit our website, invisibleemployeeadvocates.com, to subscribe to our newsletter, purchase our book, and learn more about how we can help you strengthen your workplace to become more supportive of working caregivers.